Hi, I'm Debbie Moraes, and once again, welcome to Legal Matters, the program that's been designed to address timely, relevant, critical, sometimes contentious issues that are facing consumers and businesses today. It's legal information, practical solutions, and straight talk about a wide variety of topics that will affect your home and work life. Today, the topic is about your work life, starting a small business specifically. Small businesses comprise most of the businesses in the U.S. The idea of starting a business is exciting, it's challenging, hopefully it's rewarding and profitable too. Whether you're starting a business because it's been your lifelong dream, or whether you're doing it by default because you've been downsized or fired, it's important for you to know things before you start. So what is it you need to know? And especially when you're first starting a business. What questions should you ask yourself? How should you structure a business? What are the forms of ownership? How does it affect you legally and perhaps financially? So let's talk to our lawyers as we usually do. We would like to welcome once again, as I usually say, from Bazar, Grasso law firm in East Providence, I would say that usually, Jackie Grasso to my left, and to her left, David Bazar. Today I want to say, talking about starting a new business, there is a new one. And good luck to the new business, which is Bazar, Grasso, law firm in East Providence. So good luck to you in your new business. So let's get started. Help us understand, what are the kinds of things that people should consider when they're going to start a new business, whether it's a small home-based business or perhaps something very ambitious? What things should they think about?
I guess the first thing we would talk about is, what is the corporate structure going to be? Is it a partnership, an LLC, an incorporation of some type? And what Jackie and I did is we formed a professional corporation. So it's Bazar and Grasso PC, legally. That's the name of the entity.
PC?
PC, Professional Corporation. And it's a corporation. If you were forming, Deb Murray, Inc., it's the same type of corporation. It's the same forms and same registration with the Secretary of State's office. It's just that as lawyers or accountants, you can use the designation PC, Professional Corporation, instead of INC, Inc.
Or instead of subchapter S's
well,
and
that's
all the rest?
Now you're talking about the tax structure.
Okay.
And what we did is we talked to our accountant first. And
always want to talk to your accountant.
Always, because what happens is the driver of what kind of partnership or LLC or incorporation you want to do is usually, to me, driven by the tax consequences. Of course, sometimes accountants will tell you to call the lawyer first, so you might get caught in a little ping pong game, but it's usually the tax issues first. So as an LLC, the partners, the members actually, as they're called, might be able to draw out profits differently. As an incorporation, as a corporation, a PC, we have a partnership that is 50-50, we draw out equally. And there are some other advantages of what you can do with retirement plans, etc. So first issue is, what kind of entity are you going to form?
And of the questions, and usually there are many, that people are trying to consider when they're going forward, I know that in various businesses, what kind of liability am I going to have? That may be a legal question as much as more than a financial or an accountant's question, but how do you put someone through their paces to determine whether or not they needed to be protected by what you call a corporate shield? Explain a little bit about that, please.
That's one of the first questions I always get from a from a client is, how can I protect my personal assets? And they believe that by putting everything in a corporation, you're going to be able to leave all of your personal assets out. And corporations are commonly known as having a limited liability, which is just that sometimes, because it can be limited liability, especially if you have a shareholder in a corporation who is not acting appropriately. And there are ways whereby, through corporate law, where you can pierce a corporate veil and get at somebody personally. But yeah, limited liability, you're able to keep your corporation and your business totally separate from your personal. What I find a lot, and you and I know this as we consulted many years ago at the CWE, most people will have a corporation, but they use the corporation, including the bank account and the assets, as their personal checking account, which is not something that you should do. So I always have to lecture the client is you absolutely have to keep everything separate. And there's a way where you can pay yourself, and there's a way where you're not supposed to pay yourself. In other words, you just can't take money out and not record it as a draw or have it as a payroll, paycheck.
So the business is a separate entity if it's formed by either an incorporation or an LLC. As a separate entity, it gives you some liability protection. If you do a partnership, for example, you don't have that protection. Right. So there's a lot of different reasons to form entities in different ways, and there might be a reason to do a partnership as opposed to an LLC or a corporation. But what Jackie's talking about is even if you form that corporation or that LLC, if you don't act accordingly and treat it as a separate entity, the people who want to sue you might be able to get at you as by piercing the corporate veil, as she said, and getting at you individually. So what we also always recommend is that you have appropriate insurance.
Well, that could be a topic in and of itself. When someone is first starting a business, and let's say it's a home-based business, they may not need to invest a lot of money in acquiring capital. Maybe they don't even need a loan to start. Good for them. But as a small business, home-based, might they say to you reasonably, I have the opportunity then to just have a sole partnership, a sole proprietorship. I don't need any other kind of entity. Is that fairly reasonable, or do you really have to push someone to ask them what kinds of exposure, financial or legal exposure, would they necessarily know? What do you ask?
I think it depends on the type of business the person is intending to open. If it's involving medical field in any way, well, I would think that you would not want to be a sole proprietor, because as being a sole proprietor, you're putting your entire personal life and personal assets at stake. So it would depend on the type of business they want. But, you know, I was in business till I met David, for myself, like 11 years, and I was always a sole proprietor. It was just a personal choice on my part. There were tax advantages, and there were probably more tax disadvantages at the time. But I had different reasons for doing it the way I did.
And if she's doing that, it's fine as long as she has insurance that protects her.
Exactly, and that's what I had. Of course, I had premises liability insurance, I had to have malpractice insurance, and I own real estate, so I had to make sure that I had an umbrella policy on my real estate in case anybody sued me for damages above and beyond what any policies I have, any professional policies I have. So I was insurance poor almost. My insurance agent, he loved me because I had so many policies, but better to be safe than sorry.
So as you and I had originally met, it was when you were starting a business, and we were
you helped me out, exactly.
It's good. But meanwhile, many businesses or would-be businesses are going to go to an online form of some information, which is valid. But the SBA or SBA.gov in Rhode Island, in Massachusetts could certainly give people some general information and some guidelines. There are even classes to help put them through paces. But nevertheless, in terms of the do-it-yourself, is that really advisable for someone who is about to embark on such an adventure where they have to go to a bank, get investors, venture capitalists, or whatever else? If they really need a significant amount of money, does that automatically trigger to you, you need to be incorporated or have something to protect you bigger than sole proprietorship?
Well, I think banks want to see a corporation.
Yeah,
but they're going to want a personal guarantee as well.
Right. So
good point.
As you go beyond just forming the corporation, there are so many other things that you have to do when you're forming a new corporation. So as you're talking about, if you need to go to the bank's going to want to see paperwork that's done appropriately for your startup entity, whatever it is. They're going to want to see a business plan if you're looking to borrow money. If you're not looking to borrow money, you just want to open up an account, you're going to have a tax ID number, which has to be obtained either through the attorney or the accountant. You're going to have all sorts of different types of things done so that you get the banking done. Then you have employees. You have to have, I would recommend a payroll service so that you have somebody who's tracking what the appropriate taxes are that being withheld and forwarded to the appropriate entity. And I would normally recommend a larger payroll service.
I was just going to say that, make sure it's bonded and insured.
Correct, definitely. Because now you're relying on them to send your employees and your employer taxes, and if they haven't sent them, there's going to be some liability on you even though they've been withheld. So you want to make sure whatever entity you're dealing with that does that is, as Jackie says, bonded, insured, and large enough that there's somebody to go back after.
Now, does that address the issue about those who collect the money but don't necessarily remit it to Uncle Sam, and that's why there's bonded, insured payroll companies to make sure that the one who subscribes to that payroll service is protected should someone have a problem with the payroll company?
Not sure I understand the
Does
question.
it, in other words, does that payroll company, you're assuming that they're going to be remitting to whom they should remit,
Correct.
namely Uncle Sam, but the bonding and insurance portion that you are suggesting, that makes sure that the person who is in business is covered in case they
That's what
balk?
we're saying. We
Correct.
want to make sure
Correct.
that there's recourse.
That's-
If somebody doesn't send the money inappropriately, there's, doing a little pyramid scheme and using it to pay this, then to pay that one, and
Yeah.
you get caught up in it, you're responsible. So you need to be able to go back and have recourse, either through their insurance or make sure they have assets that you can get at.
Address this too. When we talk about corporate shield, that's often spoken of in terms of the financial liability that you have some protection against. Does a corporate shield really protect you legally if you were against improper actions? So, for example, suppose you didn't have a payroll company and you were to be remitting these taxes yourself and you decided not to. Would the corporate shield protect you for that bad activity?
Absolutely not. The IRS can get at you regardless of the corporation.
Because
if
of
you're
the-
a partnership, you're still
Right,
personally liable. But you are, the IRS can assess you personally. They can also assess the corporation. If the corporation isn't paying the payroll tax that they're supposed to do by law, then they can pierce the corporate veil or the shield, and then they can assess the person personally. So no, that's why I say limited liability. People like the limited liability of a corporation, but sometimes that's what it is, just limited, because the government has a way of getting through that corporate shield and going after the individual personally if they're committing some type of malfeasance, not paying their payroll taxes, or just that.
Right.
I mean, not reporting income.
So the
Filing
corporate
returns.
shield doesn't help if you have bad behavior. If you are doing something illegal, there's no protection, correct?
There is absolutely certain circumstances where an individual will not be protected by the corporate shield. His own or her own bad behavior. They're still liable for their own bad behavior. That tax issue is one of those areas where they absolutely would be liable, and the corporation, if it has no assets, isn't going to stop the government from getting at whoever was responsible for remitting the money.
If you recall, too, there was a large company that went bankrupt several years ago. It was Newport Creamery. When you go bankrupt, you also are responsible for the actions of the shareholders, because the bankruptcy court is going to want to audit all of your books. So they can go back several years and they're going to look at what came in for income and what went out. And that was a major issue with that particular bankruptcy, because they were finding that the shareholders were undercapitalizing the business, putting loans into the business and using them for non-business purposes. So you are ultimately responsible in the end. In a situation like that, you have to answer to the bankruptcy court. And you can do whatever you want with your own bank account, but if you start filing bankruptcy and you've taken money out of the business knowing that you were insolvent, then there's a responsibility, and there's a chance that you could be prosecuted for fraud.
Good to know. Now, without putting you in the position of being tax accountants, when you start a business, sole proprietorship versus unincorporated business, S Corp, corporations automatically cost more for taxes. Is that correct? Rhode Island, Mass? Or
Well,
is it not correct? Because most people will ask that quickly.
What you're talking about, I think, is the notion of a C corporation, not a subchapter S corporation.
What's the difference, David?
Well, a corporation that is taxed as its own entity, when it makes a profit, is taxed. And then when that profit is distributed to its shareholders, which is in the form of a dividend, it's taxed again. So they commonly refer to that as double taxation. But it's so much more complicated than that, that I would always say the same thing that I would say to any client that calls me about what kind of corporation election do I want to make. Call your accountant.
That's the same thing I do. And sometimes I'll get the phone call back, and my accountant tells me, to ask you what's going to be my, what's the legal advantage. So we end up having that
Right.
ping pong match. You know?
Right.
So you have to always consider what the taxes are going to be, and then go out, consider what the form of organization is.
But
going
it's
to be its most
complicated
beneficial.
because there's some advantages
And disadvantages.
on that corporate structure,
Yeah.
and the double taxation on the dividends that's being paid out may not become a factor because it's offset by all these other things you can do, which includes taking bonuses and all other types of tax planning issues. So that really is an issue, as you say, for your accountant.
And what about state to state, city to city? What legal issues do people have to consider? I know Rhode Island has often been considered to be somewhat of a disadvantage because they charge a certain amount for corporation taxes. Massachusetts may not. Connecticut. What other where should someone go to get that information? Does it have to be a lawyer? Should we just figure SBA.gov?
Well, you can do that. You can get a
Or-
lot of information on the Secretary of State's website. There's a wealth of information out there.
So it actually,
Or a free program through the SBA. Or,
Right.
SBDCs.
it raises some other issues, though, that we need to talk about as we talk about startup corporations. We hired an attorney to incorporate us, and we had him file the forms because as attorneys with corporations, you have to register with the Supreme Court, so we had him do that for us. So that's the permitting, so to speak, that we have to do.
Permitting.
Permitting, so that's where it's going. So if you're opening up a restaurant, there's permitting that you have to do to open that up. You have to have a victualer's license. Perhaps if you want to sell liquor, you have to have a liquor license. If you're going to make sales at retail, you have to have a permit to make sales at retail, to collect the sales tax. For all these other issues, there are all these other permits you have to get. Now, the Secretary of State's website in Rhode Island will help you through a lot of that. If you're going to be cutting hair, there's perhaps licenses you have to have that, a plumbing license if you're being a plumber.
Or real estate,
Yeah,
et cetera.
they all have different permitting requirements, and you have to register with the Department of Business Regulation, and that's what governs what you do, or wherever else. And then cities and towns have their own regulations and things that you have to apply for. So you need to make sure you get all the permits that are necessary to operate your business.
And if you are working out of your home, you might have some other additional forms to fill out for the city or town in which you live, perhaps?
Some cities or towns may not allow you to work out of your home if you're not zoned commercially. So if you're using your garage to fix cars, you're going to have an issue with the city or
Right.
town if it's not zoned commercially. If you're working out of your house and you're doing billing or legal
Bookkeeping.
research, that's a different story. But what people need to understand is if they're using their home as a home-based office, they can write that off. They can write off whatever percentage of the house they're using on their personal taxes. However, when you go to sell your home, now you have an issue because it may result in some capital gains because you're writing off part of that to a business entity.
Right.
Good to know.
Yeah.
I do want to talk about how we use attorneys, but considering you both are attorneys, why would you be having an attorney file your incorporation papers? Because certainly you would know how to do that for yourselves.
There's many reasons why, and I actually do that for other people.
Yes.
However, when you're starting a new business, there's so many things that you have to do that I don't want everything on my plate and Jackie's plate. So where we can get professional help, we do that. So we hired a professional lawyer to help us do all the paperwork we needed to do that. We have an attorney who's reviewing agreements that are being drafted, and we can do that as well, but what do they say, that the worst client is the attorney who represents himself, or something like that? We didn't want to go down that road. We wanted to make
The
sure.
other thing is we're so focused on marketing and running our practice.
The
We may
business
not
of
think
your
of
business.
yeah, we may
Right.
not think of things, and actually our attorney has thought of things that we actually didn't address, and so did the attorney who's writing up
Right.
the agreements. We have actually two different attorneys working on.
Right, different aspects of what we have to get done.
Yeah, yeah.
Good to know.
Yeah.
And for those of us who want to say so much we can do online by ourselves, or so many things we can learn about ourselves, isn't it interesting that you two as lawyers are still advocating the use of
We
a
are.
listing of professional
Right.
services?
And I think that the saying was the client who has himself as an attorney is the fool or something like that. There's too many things when you're starting up a business that you have to do that you can overlook something really important that you would never overlook for a client. Yeah. But why not make sure you're protected?
Comment about this too, if you would. Not that I'm asking you to be a tax accountant again or a bank, but if someone comes to you and is discussing the forms of ownership that they might consider, suppose right now they don't need money, but they think later on they might. Maybe they want venture capitalists, maybe they want some investors. Can you help someone or give us some insight about being a sole proprietor versus having a general partnership versus having a corporation? How does that weigh out in view of the eyes of the potential investor?
So an investor,
someone outside is going to give the money.
Who is just going to lend money,
yes,
is going to look at your business plan and your ability to pay the loan back. An investor who is investing for an ownership of that business can't invest in a sole proprietorship because by its very nature it's owned by one person. So you have to have something to sell. So if you're going to be looking for investors, you would probably want to form a corporation where there's stock so that you can sell that stock interest. Now you get into a very complicated area which is regulated by the SEC because depending on how big that offering is to raise capital depends what forms you have to file with the federal government.
And you do really need to get an accountant in that situation.
And a lawyer.
And a lawyer. You know, one of the other things we talk about is what if somebody has a product? They may have issues with trademark, patenting. So you may not, in addition to getting an attorney to set up your corporation, you may need to consult with a patent attorney and a trademark attorney.
Right.
That's a very complicated area. It's very complicated.
And we can only touch on it here, but that's
yes.
valid too.
Yeah.
What about the joint venture or some short-term project that a company wants to enter into or that two people want to enter into? They're not planning on doing business together for the rest of their lives, but they do have something that they want to, a product they want to launch or a service or something. Can you address that a bit too?
Yeah, corporations, even large corporations, oftentimes will enter into joint venture agreements where they're saying, all right, you have the ability to make light bulbs, say for example, and we have the ability to make lamps, and we want to create a product that we can market together. So they will create, it's contract law really, it's agreements, and the joint venture agreement will lay out how long it's going to go for, what the ownership interest in the product is, and all of those things, and how it's going to wind down and terminate at the end.
Good to know. On the other side of it, while we're talking about business startup, what about the potential dissolution of a business? Now, nobody starts a business thinking that they're going to end it, or that no one starts a partnership or whatever, thinking that they're going to go out of business and have to deal with it. But the fact is, somebody, namely folks like you, might likely help someone consider that end of life of that business. How do you discuss that in terms of anticipating what form of business they should consider?
Well, if somebody comes in wanting to start a new business, I don't want to discourage them and ask them, you know, what would you, I wouldn't want to probably discuss dissolving a corporation if
But what we would do
yeah.
is if it's a partnership, you'd have a partnership agreement that lays some of that out.
But what the risks are and what, yeah, that's right. The agreement's going to say what happens if we dissolve. You know, which partner is going to get what. They're going to be looking at the agreement. If there isn't an agreement, then you're going to be going to the just
shareholder agreement. Yeah. It's almost a little bit like a prenup.
Yeah, so, that's the first thing I thought of.
Right.
Your exit strategy.
Right. Yeah, but it's part of an overall agreement that deals with not just what happens on dissolution, but how the firm's going to be run.
It's all incorporated. So how are you going to handle profits and losses? If, you know, while you're in business, or what happens when you dissolve, you know? If one partner owns 70, the other partner owns 30, does that mean the profit and losses are going to be shared that way?
Right. And what is the agreement as to who's responsible for doing what while the practice is being run? Are you responsible for the management? Are you responsible for sales? Are you responsible for marketing? You can lay all that out in a partnership or a shareholders agreement as well.
So that's a very good point, David. However, suppose someone comes in with a business plan. By then they should have addressed their form of ownership, how they're going to do it. But if they're just starting that business plan and some of those elements likely are jotted down now, how am I going to make business? How am I going to make sales? How am I going to execute sales? Could you then work with them, not to do a business plan certainly, but could you work with them to help integrate the other kinds of contracts and other legal issues that are going on? I'm going to buy a building, I should lease a building.
Yeah, we always do that.
Right.
That's always an essential part of setting up a corporation. If they need a storefront, we actually suggest that we look at the lease, and we negotiate leases as well.
And if you have a key employee that you want to have an employment contract for, we'll deal with that. There's a lot of, that's what I'm saying, there's so many issues that you want to deal with when you're starting up a new corporation, a new business, that talking to an attorney is sort of essential at the beginning, even if you are an attorney.
And would you be able to, never mind take care of business, which we know you can do, can you also help parcel it out so that it becomes more manageable for someone? Namely, first we need to do this, secondly we'll look at that lease, thirdly we'll talk about key man insurance or whatever. Would that be part of what you would do as lawyers dealing with a new business?
Sure. Yes. And one of the things you just mentioned, key man insurance, now that can be part of your shareholders agreement or your partnership agreement is, what if one of us dies? How do we deal with that? So you can have insurance to fund the buyout. You can create almost any kind of buyout you want for many different reasons. For example, if Jackie and I created a new business, which we did, and she wanted to leave to practice somewhere else, we might do a buyout on a certain percentage based on that. If she was leaving to do something else, she'd be entitled to more. And of course, if something happened to her and she passed away, her estate should be entitled to buy out her share of the business upon her death. And that's where the insurance would come into play.
So of course, all of this sounds a little bit daunting. And lest someone become feeling like they're overwhelmed before they even start, when someone walks in to see you and tells you that they're going to start a business, I imagine that it would be wise to ask you, what is this going to cost me if I work with you? How do I work with you? How do we meet this? How do we plan this? What would you say? How would you help someone go through this?
It would more than likely be an hourly rate.
Okay.
Yeah. And we would say, what is it that you need us to do? What we would do is, in the initial consultation, we'd lay out, here are all the issues you have to think
Free
about.
consultation?
Yes.
The first,
No.
yep,
Okay.
initial. So here's everything that you need to do. These are all the issues you need to think about. What have you already thought about? What do you want to address? Here's our recommendations. And then if they say, well, incorporate us, get us our tax ID number, make the S election if that's what we're doing, and create a partnership agreement, but we'll take care of the other things. Then we'll price it accordingly.
And we work in conjunction with an accountant.
Right, always.
Would you bring in the accountant? Would they have to bring an accountant?
I would insist that they get an accountant. So if they, and quite often they'll ask me, can I have a referral? And I will refer them out to several different accountants.
Good to know. And thinking back on the days when I had done some small business consulting too, an EIN number, who needs that and who doesn't? Sole proprietors, corporations, who needs it?
Everybody should have it. As a sole proprietor, I had one, because otherwise your social security number is on everything.
Right.
You have to have it for a corporation, of course.
So it's your employee identification number. If you have employees, you have to have that to properly pay the state their payroll taxes.
Well, we certainly do go through an enormous amount of issues related to starting a business rather than just even talking about the industry. Each industry has its own. So we'd like to thank, once again, Jackie Grasso and David Bazar of the newly formed business that is in East Providence, Bazar and Grasso, not Odette Bazar, Condero Grasso. Good luck in your venture, and we thank you for tuning in. Our discussion of legal matters will continue. Join us.